Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Junia Doan's The Spark. I'm Junia Doan, and thank you for joining us. My guest today is Dr. Jason D. Gulley, a photojournalist and geology professor whose images have been featured in National Geographic, the New York Times, Geo, and many other international magazines and newspapers. Welcome, Jason. You have a PhD in geology. What at that level does it actually cover?
Geology is a super broad subject these days, so it covers almost anything that could happen on the planet, although typically dealing with rocks or things that rocks turn into.
And you made a specialty of glaciology. What is that?
When I did my PhD, I focused on glaciers and ice sheets, and specifically how meltwater flow through glaciers and ice sheets affects how fast they move and how fast they melt. So glaciology as a subject is trying to understand, these landforms that are created by snow that gets compacted and turns into literal rivers of ice that are, flowing and moving across the landscape.
I read that avalanches cause glaciers. Could you explain?
Yeah, so in most parts of the world, glaciers form where you have a whole bunch of snow that accumulates and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And the weight of the snow compacts down on top of itself and it fuses all of those snow crystals together into glacier ice that begins to then move down slope. In high mountain regions, like in Nepal, Mount Everest, the Andes, parts of the Andes, but specifically in the Himalayas, a lot of the glaciers are actually fed by avalanches. So there's no big accumulation zone where snow is kind of gradually getting thicker and then more dense and progressively turning into glacier ice. The glacier just starts because avalanches have piled up so much snow at the base of a mountain slope.
Can you predict when an avalanche is coming?
You can tell when the conditions are conducive to avalanches. Like there are, like certain types of like slope angles and precipitation patterns, snowfall patterns, and weather patterns that make it more likely for there to be an avalanche than in other times of the winter. But like predicting exactly when an avalanche is going to happen is almost impossible.
For those who do helicopter skiing, is that a risk of avalanches, or they can protect themselves by careful choosing and weather reports?
So a lot of people who are doing backcountry skiing spend a lot of time trying to understand what the avalanche risk is going to be like. Because in particular, like high mountain environments where you're out there all by yourself with no ski patrol is very unforgiving. So, if the conditions are conducive to avalanches, a lot of times people are not going to be out in the backcountry skiing until the conditions are a little bit more stable.
Do glaciers differ depending on what region they're in?
They do. Glaciers can be. So the glacier ice itself can vary from place to place based on temperature. So in places like the Alps or southern Alaska, where the environment is relatively warm, those glaciers tend to be like right at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you just increase the temperature a little bit, they're going to start melting. But I used to live in Svalbard for big chunks of the year when I was in graduate school. It's at 78 degrees north. So if you go all the way to the top of Greenland and you turn right, the next place that you run into is Svalbard. And the glaciers up there, many of them, the glaciers are frozen to their bed. The ice temperature is maybe minus 11 or minus 9 degrees centigrade. The Greenland ice sheet, huge sections of the Greenland ice sheet, the ice is like colder than freezing, but as you get closer to the bed, because of all of the friction of the ice grinding across the landscape and the ice crystals grinding across each other, then you actually end up having ice that's at the pressure melting point.
What air temperature and what water temperature level has to is needed to preserve the glacier or even grow the glacier? Can you?
Yeah, you can absolutely grow glaciers. So they have to start somehow, and so typically you're going to need to make sure that the average annual temperature is going to be below zero.
You mean the air temperature?
The average, yes.
Water, can it form from underneath or not? No, because
No,
it's
so
frozen.
glaciers are going to form entirely as a result of snowfall. So that the water temperature, the water temperature inside of glaciers, except for volcanic regions, is always going to be pretty much right at freezing.
You said that skiers have difficulty but are interested in projecting when they're going to have an avalanche. Do you all do any better?
So a lot of the places that I work in, the avalanche risk isn't super high because I'm walking around on the surface of the glacier. Now, some of the places that I work in the Himalayas, they're at certain times of the year, the avalanche risks can be quite high, but we tend to work in times of the year when there's not a whole lot of snowfall and the avalanche risk is quite a bit lower. I mean, that being said, I've been walking around on glaciers and seen some pretty ginormous avalanches crashing into the glaciers, just not in the areas where we were working.
Tell us about your research field in caves.
I got really interested in caves as a kid. My parents took me on all of these summer trips to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and like one of the first trips that we did to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, as kids, we got to go on one of what was called like the Little Kids Wild Cave Tour. I think it was called the Junior Ranger Cave Tour or something, where you had little plastic hard hats and lights, and got to go off tour with the Rangers, and that pretty much established me as a cave nut for the rest of my life. So as soon as I got a driver's license, I started driving over to Indiana and going caving a lot of the time. Started doing a lot of hardcore caving and expeditions when I was an undergrad, and I would drop out of college pretty regularly to go on these expeditions. Well, fast forward to graduate school and later on, like all of the time that I'd spent kind of neglecting my studies and learning how to safely explore caves and develop all the technical skills for rope work and everything else actually ended up being really important for the type of research that I do as a scientist. So a lot of the work that I do inside glacier caves is built on my ability to safely operate and explore and access these environments that most scientists had considered off limits, because most scientists didn't have that technical cave exploration background that I had at the same time that I started studying glaciers.
How did you know or apply for or be accepted in these expeditions when you were learning?
Just for cave expeditions, these were all cave expeditions in limestone, and as you start learning how to explore and map caves, there's no like formal education process for it in the United States. There's just like loosely organized groups of people and friends who go explore and map caves on the weekend. When you think about most of the planet's been mapped. There's not a whole lot of places in the world where you can go and do like pure exploration anymore. But it's crazy to think that you can crawl into some farmer's hole in a field in Kentucky and end up someplace that nobody's ever been before. And for me, that was super exciting.
Did you have to develop a sense of curiosity, or was that your stance in life?
I think I've always been really curious. I always wanted to know how things work. I was really good at taking things apart. I was less good at putting them back together. I think one of the things that I love about caves, is that they're a puzzle, and you have to kind of figure it out as you go. As a kid, I really loved the choose your own adventure books, where you could have to make these decisions that would change the outcome of the entire novel. But ultimately, I ended up reading like all the stories in parallel. But I just have always loved trying to like figure out how things are connected to each other. What's the thread that ties everything together? And underground, you're crawling around in the dark in this three-dimensional maze that you're trying to explore and map and make sense of all at the same time.
Can you predict where a cave is, or do you have to crawl around and hope your luck is good?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit like, just imagine any kind of surface drainage that you can think of. And, like imagine the Mississippi River basin, right? You can think like, well, there are places where you're going to be more likely to have river channels than others. Like if there was no map and it was dark all the time, you would know like if you kept walking downhill, you're eventually going to run into a river channel and that channel is going to run into another channel. So you can kind of build a predictive framework for where you're likely to find rivers, but you wouldn't necessarily know exactly where they are. It's kind of the same thing with cave systems. We get a pretty good idea of like where to go to look for them, but we don't really know exactly how far they're going to go or anything like that until they're completely explored. So one of the things that's fascinating about them, like if you want to plan a caving or a climbing expedition or a kayaking expedition or something, you can go to Google Earth and you can get satellite imagery. Whereas when you're working underground, there's none of that. You're just literally like checking behind every rock to see if the cave keeps going.
Are they covered on four sides or three sides? How do you know you've discovered one?
Yeah, so most of the time there's going to be an entrance on the surface. Sometimes they're ginormous. Like some of the cave entrances, on the Greenland ice sheet are big enough that you could imagine like a really good helicopter pilot flying a helicopter into it. Others are a couple meters in diameter. Some of them are so small that you can barely physically fit in, and they'll get a little bit bigger as you go down. But without an entrance, it's usually really rare to find a cave. In a handful of examples, there have been like drilling projects where they've drilled into a big void, as part of building a highway or something like that that has allowed people to access caves. But those are quite rare.
And you said they don't last very long, maybe a couple of years. What changes them?
Right. So in glacier caves, the caves are super dynamic. So the glacier ice itself, like ice, everybody think about ice as being solid, like when it's in your cocktail and you shake it around, it's like banging off of the glass and everything. It's not really moving. But under pressure, under like hundreds of feet of ice, it actually starts to flow and ooze like silly putty. And so if you poke a hole in silly putty and you put a weight on top of it, that hole slowly squeezes shut. And the exact same thing happens inside glacier caves. So every year when you form a cave and there's meltwater flowing through it and it's constantly enlarging the cave, as soon as winter comes along and there's no longer meltwater flowing through the ice and making the cave bigger, the ice starts to squeeze shut. And if you're under 300 feet of ice or so, like that cave's going to squeeze shut in the time scale of a couple of weeks. So I always joke that if you feel like the walls are closing in on you and you're super claustrophobic, glacier caving is probably not for you because the walls really are closing in on you.
Oh, but what makes the pressure is succeeding avalanches with their grit and their snow right on top. So I'm surprised to hear a cave could be 300 feet down.
Well, so we know that some of the caves on the Greenland ice sheet go through more than a kilometer of ice. It's just that most of it's full of water, so it would be very difficult to explore them.
And you took pictures of them.
I have, yeah.
Do you need a certain kind of camera or setting or battery or?
Yeah, so I'm using like a regular camera, the same type of camera that people use for wildlife photography or fashion photography. It's really cold, so frequently I'll have an extra battery that's inside my jacket, so it's constantly being warmed by my body in case the cold like sucks all the juice out of the battery. I will say that modern lithium-ion batteries are pretty good these days, so it's not all that common that I have to cycle batteries. It has to be really cold for me to have to cycle batteries through the camera. The caves are super dark. So the thing that I do that's maybe a little bit different is I have to bring in a lot of different flash units that are wirelessly connected to my camera. So when I press a button, sometimes there's like 5 or 6 other flashes that all go off at the same time, and that's what's providing light to the cave.
So I still you're scuba diving down there, and do you have a light like what miners do to sort of look ahead? How do you gain understanding? Is there a GPS?
Yeah, so when I'm inside the glacier caves, we wouldn't be scuba diving. We're in air, and I've got a light on top of my head, just like the miners. And we can use that to kind of explore and look around. The lights are super bright, but when I go and I put all these extra flash units out, I'm putting them in ways that help me illuminate really big spaces underground and make them feel three-dimensional. So underwater, I do kind of the same things. I don't usually have a light on my head when I'm underwater because it's super easy to blind your dive buddy And like, when you're driving in the fog and you turn your high beams on and it's really hard to see anything,
Back.
it's the same thing underwater because of all the backscatter. So underwater, we tend to put our lights on the back of our hand so that we can hold it off to the side, and it allows us to see a lot better. But other than that, like, the principles are the same. I've got the same kind of camera that a fashion photographer would use, except that it's in an underwater housing. And I can't talk to any of my dive assistants or photo assistants when I'm underwater. So it makes the logistics of a shoot a little bit more complicated. But
When you find one cave, are you likely to find others nearby, or is that not a useful thing to explore?
yeah, I mean, typically, if you're in an area that has one cave, there's going to be lots of other caves nearby because the geological conditions that are needed to make caves tend to be, quite vast.
What are the satisfactions for you of doing this?
I always loved reading books about exploration as a kid. And, for me, being able to explore a place that nobody's ever been before, map it, research it, and then photograph it, for like publications and newspapers and stuff. It pretty much, like, in like a single trip, encompasses everything I ever dreamed that I would be able to do as when I was a kid. It's growing up in a small town in Ohio. I kind of explored the world with National Geographic magazine. It was before the internet, before Instagram. If you grew up in a cornfield and you wanted to know what Laos looked like, there weren't a lot of other options other than National Geographic magazine. And, having these kind of scientists, explorers with cameras running around the world, I was always wanted to be one of those. It's been kind of exciting to grow up and actually get to be one.
You're living your dream.
Yeah, it took a
Very
while,
few
but
people have a chance to say that. So you're a lucky fellow, really a lucky fellow. So I read AI is going to transform everything, or a lot of everything, almost everything. Can you see it being a help or a hindrance to you?
AI. I think a lot of times when some new technology comes out, everybody tends to get a little scared about it. I tend to think that human creativity is always going to be valued, and that people are going to figure out ways to use AI to maybe make life. I'm sure that there's going to be like super scary uses of AI and everything else, but I feel like you know, the AI is probably not going to put photographers out of work. I don't think it's going to put scientists out of work. I just find it really difficult to imagine AI as being creative. And I think that creativity is something that is maybe uniquely human. At least I hope that it's uniquely human. I don't know. Maybe it's just kind of pie in the sky wishful thinking, but I think that in the end, that people are always going to value something that was created by a person.
So experience plus intuition.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you think about it, like, there is still, I think when photography came out, everybody just imagined that painters would be completely and totally out of work. And, but there's still people that are painting because people still value that. And it's the same thing with like photography. A lot of photography is being replaced by AI, generated content. But I think at the end of the day, that really good creative photographers are still going to get hired to be really good creative photographers. There's just something about that human element. Maybe we can't necessarily put our fingers on it, but people still like it and value it.
So how did the sequence start? You started as a photographer, or you felt you had to learn because you saw such wonderful things? And when did you take up scuba diving? Was that to go down and see these things? Just if you were a student starting out, what would you recommend?
Well,
It,
like a lot of things in my life, it were kind of accidents, and each one of them I realized when I was doing it that this was pretty incredible, and I wanted to kind of keep doing it. Photography, I originally just wanted a little camera that I could attach to my telescope to take pictures of the moon, but the only camera that you could connect to a telescope was like a single lens reflex camera. I begged my parents to let me get one, and my mom was like, I don't think you're ever gonna. I think you're gonna get tired of trying to figure out all the settings and everything else, and it's just going to sit on a shelf like other stuff that you bought over the years. So they eventually acquiesced and let me get one, and then they got me some books on how to use it. And I eventually got so fascinated with photography that I never actually connected it to my telescope. I just ran around and started taking pictures in the backyard. That eventually turned into a job for my local newspaper, where I started shooting photos for a local newspaper and writing newspaper stories. Um, then I kind of accidentally became a scientist when I went to university. But those photo skills and the writing skills that I developed working at the newspaper became super valuable as I was exploring glacier caves, because it's like all of a sudden I'm in this like totally new alien environment that hasn't really been described scientifically before. And I've got all these photo skills that I've developed over the years to be able to take pictures of it and share it with other scientists.
Interesting. When you say you almost became a scientist accidentally, what was the accident?
I I ended up going rock climbing with a glaciologist from Scotland, and he was describing these like glacial lake outburst floods, these big lakes that would form on glaciers in the Mount Everest region of Nepal, and they just kind of explode out of the side of the glacier and cause floods down the valley. And he had some pictures of like the drainage features that they would go through, and they looked exactly like caves. He kept calling them like glacial conduits or inglacial conduits, and I was like, "That's a cave." And so I got super excited, and I was like, what do these caves look like inside? He's like, well, nobody's ever been in them. They're super dangerous. And it kind of struck me. I was like, well, if nobody's been in them, how do you know that they're dangerous? So I took him to a limestone cave the next day. I was living in Kentucky at the time. He was rock climbing relatively near where I lived, and I was like, look, as a geologist who spent a lot of my life, mapping and exploring caves. A lot of my life, I was in my 20s, but I was like, if we go and we map caves and we pay attention to all the structural features and the limestone and the shapes of the cave passages, we know from like over a century's worth of work in limestone that we can understand how those caves formed. If we take and apply all of those same techniques to glaciers, which no one has done yet, then I'm pretty sure we can figure out how the glacier caves formed. And then that was, for me, like we ended up writing a couple of proposals on the back of a napkin at a bar that night. And that was kind of the start of it. It was like, I'm going to be able to go and do exploration and mapping, and it's going to be like real legitimate science. And it just also happened to be inside of a glacier on Everest, which made it even
You're an
better.
amazing person. Inspiration, activity, entrepreneur, sail the world, see it. And also a recognition of opportunity, um, and scuba diving. Now I read that you teach it. Is it for scientific research? What's different?
Yeah, so that was another accident. I was totally uninterested in scuba diving. My mom wanted to take us on a family vacation before I was the oldest in the family. I joined the military, and I think she wanted to do something really cool for everybody before we all kind of went our separate ways. And scuba diving was it, which I just didn't think was really going to be all that exciting, but completely changed my life. I'm the only person in the family who kept scuba diving after that trip, and so like now I've created a class at the university where I teach students how to do research underwater. I bought all of the equipment for students. I'm an instructor for everything, because one of the things that I saw was that the only people who were able to do research underwater were people who were from like fairly well-to-do backgrounds. And there was this big gap
Oh,
for people who didn't have that kind of a background. And I felt like means shouldn't exclude people from being able to work in this incredible environment. When I first started working inside underwater caves and trying to do research underwater, it was like the 90s when banks would give you a loan on anything. So I took out a loan on my car, which is ridiculous. It wasn't even a nice car. It was a
yeah.
1995 Ford Aspire. And, that's what I used to buy my first set of dive equipment. And then I would just beg, borrow, and steal classes and equipment. And when I became a professor, I just wanted to make it easier for students to be able to get into that type of research.
Is it a different skill to go scientific diving?
So the big thing with scientific diving is that typically you're doing an experiment, or you're surveying or counting things. So there's a lot of task loading that's associated with it. It's a little bit like, just imagine recreational diving, like normal scuba diving. It's just kind of like driving your car. But for scientific diving, there might be 6 or 7 other things that you're doing at the same time. So it's like driving your car while you're having a teleconference and eating lunch and then having a conversation with somebody in the back seat. It starts to get really busy. So a lot of scientific diving is just trying to help people understand how to manage all of that in a really complex three-dimensional underwater environment where, I mean, let's face it, like you have to be able to breathe when you're underwater, or you're just not going to live for very long.
I understand photography now, but how do you record your voice on what you're observing or questioning or want to come back to? I think in scuba diving, normally you're in contact with someone at the surface. Is that right or wrong?
So most of the time you don't have any kind of any kind of voice contact with the surface. And in some environments, mostly commercial diving, you'll have a hard hat that you're wearing, and then you can actually communicate through a microphone to the surface. But with most scuba diving, you got a regulator in your mouth, so it makes it difficult to talk. So when you're swimming around, you're taking notes. Yeah. So you're kind of writing on underwater paper or slates.
I didn't know there was underwater paper. Thank you for teaching me this.
Oh, yeah.
I have to interrupt because we're out of time, but it's such a fascinating field, and I'm so glad that you're doing it and that you're mindful of inviting people in and making it easier for them to do that. So thank you for kindly answering all these questions. And to the audience, I always say, go out and do something kind for someone you know and someone you don't know. And remember to repeat it every day going forward. People will appreciate a smile or a step aside or whatever you can figure out. And for sure, I will see you next time. Bring your questions and let me know what they are. And again, thank you to the professor for detailing his wonderful discoveries.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
To contact Junia, send her an email at juniadonsthespark@gmail.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadonthespark.com. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on Junia Doan's The Spark.
Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.